Buddy, I hope you've had a nice weekend. We are meeting here today. It's the 10th meeting of the House Committee on Industry and Technology. As per the deliberations of the committee last week, we are meeting for the first of three on the state of the auto sector. The witnesses that we have with us here today, all in the room, include from the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association, Hugh Williams, who is the national spokesperson, alongside Charles Bernard, chief economist from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. From the Global Automakers of Canada, we've got David Adams, the President and Chief Executive Officer, and from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, Brian Kingston. Apologies, I think I said, Mr. Bernard, you were from the Vehicle Manufacturers Association. I should have said the Automotive Dealers Association. My apologies. Witnesses, just a quick reminder, if you're using your headset, which if you're not fluent in French, you will need when members are speaking in French, if you have it plugged in and it's on your ear, please, or it's not on your ear rather, please make sure that you place it on the sticker in front of you just to protect the health and well-being of our interpreters. The way that today's proceedings will work is the same as it does in a regular committee meeting. So we will afford Mr. Williams, Mr. Kingston, and Mr. Adams up to 5 minutes each for their introductory remarks, followed by a line of questioning related to the number of seats around the table for all recognized political parties. Colleagues, I will probably suspend about midway through in order to just provide a little bit of a natural break for folks. We are not turning over panels. The individuals with us here today are the four that will be with us for the duration of the 2 hours. With that, Mr. Williams, I'm going to turn it over to you for upwards of 5 minutes for your introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So appreciate the invitation to be here. Good morning, bonjour. Charles, sorry about the demotion. But Charles is our chief economist for the Car Dealers Association. I'm very proud to hold that role. We brought him in from Montreal today because we're going to have 2 hours to unpack the economy, and he'll be an excellent resource for you as we go through. So as most of you know, and I feel I'm at a committee room full of lots of friends because you know the auto industry, and I've met with most of you in one capacity or another to talk about the car business. The Canadian Auto Dealers Association has 3,400 franchise car dealers across the country that directly employ 178,000 Canadians. So we are a major employer in this country, and we pay approximately $6 billion in federal, provincial, and municipal taxes, contribute $28 billion to Canada's GDP. This year alone, our members will sell some 1.9 million new vehicles to Canadian families and businesses, 1.3 million used vehicles, and write 31 million service orders. Now just let that sink in for 1 second. 31 million service orders. We literally drive the economy of this country. We do the service and repair for emergency services, police services, even the military depends on our members, and we were named an essential service during COVID to keep the country rolling because doctors, nurses, hospital workers can't get to work without our members. As you know, the auto industry is in one of the most turbulent and complex periods of time that we've ever had in our history, and that's saying a lot. We've had a lot of turbulence in our industry over the years. The Prime Minister has called it a trade rupture, but on the showroom floors, we call it an affordability crisis as we're facing mounting costs that seem to be multiplying on all kinds of different levels. The trading framework that is the foundation of our business is becoming increasingly chaotic because of the U.S. administration. And during this president's first administration, we ran a very high-profile campaign in Canada and the U.S., tied in with our American partners, the National Auto Dealers Association, to deliver the message on both sides of the border that tariffs were bad for the economies in both countries, bad for the auto industry in both countries, bad for dealers, but most importantly, terrible for consumers in Canada and the U.S. This past July, we led a trade mission down to Washington, D.C., and thank you to the embassy and the different trade offices that accommodated us, to meet with over 30 congressional leaders, senior senators plugged into the Trump administration and the auto sector down there, congressional leaders, and senior members of the administration, again, to deliver the message that Canadian car dealers and our customers we're, in fact, the largest consumer of U.S. exported vehicles in the world. So in many ways, they're shooting themselves in the foot by putting tariffs on their largest customer. If you look at the next three countries, Germany, Mexico, and China, which are the next largest export markets for the U.S. Auto industry, we're larger than those three combined. So our message is resonating that this is not the right thing to do in the U.S. We can tell you, because we're on the front lines of the affordability challenge, that our members are concerned about affordability and our customers are concerned about affordability. Recent study by Deloitte showed that 67% of Canadians expect to pay $500 a month for their vehicle. The fact is, though, however, that the average payment for a lease in this country is $770, and the average payment for a loan is $880. So it's substantially higher than what customers' expectations are. And this is only going to get worse as all of these trade issues and tariffs, steel, aluminum, copper, other inputs, and auto work their way through the system. So our message today is that we have to get our own market in place to be effective. We have to make sure that this is a competitive place to invest and a competitive place to sell vehicles. If we talk about the federal EV mandate, that's one of the major impediments that our dealers are worried about. The federal government's most recent decision to pause those mandates and the 2026 targets is a good first step. We're appreciative of that. But now is the time to take it the next step further and eliminate those mandates. I would say, importantly, that we already have a backstop of greenhouse emissions targets that are set out by Environment Canada regulations that achieve the same thing but are technologically neutral. I would also say, in terms of getting rid of inefficient taxes, the so-called luxury tax should be eliminated in this country. As I mentioned, in terms of affordability, the average vehicle in this country is now north of $60,000, and it's not uncommon for workers, electricians, people in the construction space to buy work trucks that are in excess of $100,000. These are not luxury vehicles. We already have a perfect tax system, the GST, that as you pay more for any good, you pay more tax. That's the way it should be. I can tell you, with CRA in a disarray, and I'm not the one saying it, it's the Auditor General, it's the Canadian public, now's the time to clean house and get rid of that inefficient tax. We had, in fact, a dealer who had not sold a vehicle over $100,000, had an auditor come to his office, and he told him, listen, we haven't sold that kind of car yet, so it should be a short order. We can give you our list of sales. They're all south of $100,000. It took them 3 days to work through the process to verify that. So it's not an efficient tax. I would also say that in terms of the regulatory framework, our CADA president put out a framework that talked about the need to be able to harmonize with other jurisdictions in which we have free trade agreements in order to get niche products into the country, and where we have a framework where there's joint safety and emissions, we should accept vehicles from other jurisdictions where we have free trade agreements. Notably, that would include Europe, South Korea, and Japan. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Mr. Kingston, welcome. 5 minutes for you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chair, honourable members, thank you for the invitation to appear here today. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, CVMA, is the industry association representing Canada's leading manufacturers of light and heavy-duty motor vehicles. Our membership includes Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. CVMA members have been operating in Canada for over 100 years. They're responsible for most of the auto production in this country, having built over 100 million vehicles since 1945. Those are the earliest records that we have, but of course production goes back further than that. They're also the largest employers in the auto manufacturing sector, supporting over 20,000 direct jobs, the majority of which are unionized. Simply put, the auto industry and its supply chain would not exist today if it were not for the commitments of Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis in Canada. Now, due to U.S. trade actions, the automotive industry is under unprecedented stress. Tariffs of 25% applied on finished vehicles built in Canada fundamentally challenge the existence and future of the industry. Over 90% of production is destined for the U.S. There is no industry without U.S. access. Diversification is not an option, as markets in Europe and Asia are better served by assembly plants in those regions. The future of the industry and the hundreds of thousands of jobs it supports depends on securing our trade relationship with the United States, and because of that, our top priority is to remove the U.S. Section 232 tariffs. These tariffs and Canada's retaliatory measures are doing enormous damage to the integrated supply chain. In the first 10 months of this year, automakers will pay $10.6 billion in tariffs on the vehicles they import from Canada and Mexico. That doesn't include, of course, the additional tariffs on steel and aluminum. And according to the Center for Automotive Research, U.S. tariffs alone will cost the U.S. industry $188 billion over the next 3 years. So we're now in a situation where it is more cost effective to manufacture a vehicle in Japan or Germany and export it to the U.S. as opposed to manufacturing in North America for North America. Doesn't make sense. Once the U.S. tariffs are removed, the renewal of CUSMA needs to be the priority for the federal government. The CUSMA is the foundation of the integrated North American automotive industry. It provides certainty, it reinforces the long-established integration of the supply chain necessary for our competitiveness, and it ultimately facilitates regulatory alignment of vehicle technical regulations. The uncertainty that continues to hang over the industry, also the broader Canadian economy, around the future of Canada's relationship with the U.S. is making it nearly impossible for companies to commit capital in Canada. Now, clearly, securing these outcomes that I just outlined is not guaranteed and not all within our control. So as the Prime Minister has said recently, in a rapidly changing and uncertain world, Canada's new government is focused on what we can control. We agree. There are things in Canada's control that can be implemented today to strengthen the industry and bolster our competitiveness as a manufacturing powerhouse. Priority one is the elimination of the federal EV mandate, known as the Electric Vehicle Availability Standard. This regulation is prioritizing EV sales over the development of our North American EV supply chain. It is a direct challenge to our competitiveness as an auto manufacturing jurisdiction because it is levying punitive costs on companies that do not achieve these arbitrary sales targets. Under this regulation, the vehicles manufactured here in Canada today are being phased out by the government. This is an inexplicable situation. And then compounding that, of course, are federal legal threats against companies and the imposition on auto companies that import from the United States. Auto companies without a Canadian footprint, no Canadian footprint, are now better positioned than those that have been building here for over a century, as they do not face any tariffs. So the result is there's little incentive remaining to build vehicles in Canada today. Now, we can change this, but we have to have a collaborative effort, government, working with industry, working with labor to address these challenges, and there is a future for this sector. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to all the questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingston. Mr. Adams, upwards of 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak to you today. On behalf of the 16 members of the Global Automakers of Canada. The Global Automakers of Canada is a national trade association representing the Canadian interests of 16 of the world's most significant automakers. Our members are collectively responsible for more than 62% of vehicle sales in Canada, and our two manufacturing members, Toyota and Honda, are Canada's largest and second largest vehicle producers, representing through the end of September this year 75.5% of Canadian light-duty vehicle production. Additionally, GAC member Volkswagen and their partner PowerCo remain in the process of building up the $7 billion battery factory in St. Thomas, Ontario, that is slated to employ up to 3,000 people directly. Importantly, the members directly and indirectly employ more than 216,000 people, contribute almost $25 billion to Canada's GDP, and generate more than $10.5 billion in government revenues. At the outset, Stellantis is not one of my member companies, and even if it was, I would still have no line of sight into the agreements between the company and the federal government, because that's a confidential agreement. What I can say about Stellantis is that while at American Motors Canada, my father worked with officials from the federal government, M&O, to secure the building of the Brampton plant in question now. While few remember American Motors, that facility became an important piece of the Chrysler-Stellantis Canadian footprint, revitalizing the automotive industry in Brampton, which is to suggest that while the committee is looking at government commitments made to Stellantis, I believe the focus of this committee's work needs to be more broadly on developing a more resilient, holistic, and long-term strategy to keep the automotive sector, from parts and vehicle manufacturing all the way to sales and distribution, strong and healthy, including navigating the immediate headwinds that Mr. Kingston and Mr. Williams have highlighted. As part of that strategy, and in order to build one of the strongest and most competitive economies in the G7, we will need to ensure that any carrots or sticks related to the attraction and support of automotive investment are competitive with those of other nations. The auto sector represents Canada's second largest export sector by value and needs more than shorter-term and ad hoc programs to attract investment and support programs competitive with other nations, which is important. We also need to ensure that these programs do not get misrepresented or politicized. For instance, production-linked tax credits only exist if there is production and tax revenue to begin with. All parties should respect these provisions. To do otherwise leads to misperception across Canadian society and compromises the integrity of these programs, which are necessary to ensure that such investments do not go elsewhere. A poll undertaken last week by Polaris suggests that concern for the automotive industry is widespread, with 74% of Canadians, 79% of Ontarians believing that if the automotive sector collapsed, it would have a devastating impact on the Canadian economy. We agree. While there is rightful concern about the future of the automotive industry in Canada, let's not lose sight of the potential that exists in this sector if we work quickly to establish something like the Royal Commission on the Automotive Industry, undertaken by Vincent Blayden in 1961. With that important work undertaken, the framework for the 1965 Auto Pact with the United States was created, which established managed, tariff-free sectoral free trade in the automotive industry between the two countries. But our auto sector is very different than it was in the 1960s, which now includes high-value areas such as critical and rare earth minerals required for batteries and semiconductors, cybersecurity, and software related to connectivity and automation. These areas represent opportunities for Canadian advantage in an integrated North American automotive industry, and we need to develop a new model that we can ensure we are a partner that the U.S. truly cannot live without. Secondly, if we cannot be assured of access to the United States as part of that integrated North American industry, then Canada must expand our horizons with the G7 countries that we already have free trade agreements with and beyond. Previous governments of different political stripes have done a good job of setting up Canada with multiple FTAs that need to be considered as part of a new auto strategy. While Canada does have real strengths in each of these areas noted above, without a comprehensive strategy, however, these strengths may just remain opportunities on paper that are unable to be realized. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Adams. Okay, colleagues, we will get right into our line of questioning. Madame Dantra, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. As you know, we're looking into something that's gripped the nation in Canada. We have tens of thousands of auto sector jobs on the line here, so I appreciate your presence and your expertise very much. My first questions will be for Mr. Kingston. Of course, you're the President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicles Manufacturers Association, representing GM, Stellantis, and Ford in Canada, correct? Thank you. And so I'm sure you've been following the news, and of course Stellantis recently announced that it's moving production from the Brampton facility to the U.S., along with massive U.S. investments. At the same time, of course, as you know, Stellantis has received hundreds of millions of dollars in funding agreements, and some of that money has already flowed to various plans for retooling, as well as in addition to the $15 billion up to contract with the provincial and federal government for EV battery production. So you're aware of that. So from what we're understanding then, if Stellantis is moving production from the Brampton facility, putting up to 3,000 jobs at risk, it would seem that there was no Canada-wide jobs guarantee in those contracts. Can you comment on that?
So first of all, contracts between the federal government and Stellantis are confidential, as are all contracts negotiated between government and private sector companies. So I cannot comment specifically on any of the covenants in those agreements. But of the commitments that have been made by Stellantis, the overwhelming majority have already been executed. So of the $8 billion committed, about $7 billion has already been executed. So you have a new vehicle, electric vehicle, being built in Windsor. You've got the Nexstar battery plant that's 1,000 jobs, which is now operational. And the announcement with respect to Brampton, there are plans for Brampton. It's not a plant closure.
Right, so thank you for confirming that. So there are plans for the Bramptons that will be waiting on. I guess our concern as well is that from your other comments about the difficulties that the Canada auto sector is facing. In fact, you said Canada's competitiveness as an auto manufacturing jurisdiction is rapidly eroding, and certainly your comments today would signify that there are concerning events on the horizon. We're not through this yet in Canada, and it seems that all of your comments, in fact, would confirm that. So I suppose what we're concerned about is that this may not be the first of the Stellantis job layoffs or other companies. We're deeply concerned. We'll be paying close attention. But I did want to focus a little bit more on that. So the job losses to date that we're aware of at GM, the Oshawa plant was about 700 workers, I believe. GM in Ingersoll, of course, was announced recently. I believe it's about 500 workers lost, 1,200 more uncertain. And, of course, Stellantis, 3,000 uncertain. These investments in the U.S., the tariffs from the U.S. remain, and now you mentioned the sort of the countermeasures that are being applied. It doesn't seem that at the federal level, they're talking a lot about, which is great, the steel and aluminum, we hope to see a deal there, but there doesn't seem to be as much of a primary focus from the federal government on getting an auto sector deal. So if all things remain the same and we don't get an auto sector deal in the coming months, can you give the committee some insight of where you think the auto sector and all the jobs that entails will be in a couple of years if nothing changes, if we don't get a deal?
Yeah, if we don't get an agreement and a removal of tariffs, and if we don't get, importantly, a renewal of CUSMA, because while the 232 tariffs are having an immediate impact now, if you're a company thinking about investing in Canada and you have no certainty regarding the future relationship with the United States, which is what is codified in our CUSMA agreement, it is virtually impossible to make long-term commitments into Canada. So we need a resolution on both items, and we need that to happen rapidly, or it will be very difficult for any new investment in this country, and it will be difficult to maintain existing investment. And frankly, that's not just an automotive story. That applies to virtually every sector of the Canadian economy. We are overwhelmingly dependent on the United States. That will never change. So we have to figure this out, and we have to do it quickly.
I appreciate that. And again, you mentioned it'll be difficult to maintain new investments. So again, concerning events on the horizon for future jobs under your purview and under the purview of others here. And so if we can't control what's going on with the U.S. and if we're not going to get an auto deal, what can we control in Canada to make us more competitive? Surely there's something locally that's within our sole purview to make Canada a more competitive environment for you to stay here and to expand here in the future. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. And we've laid out a number of priorities for the government to make Canada more competitive. Look, if you look back in history, when you have a protectionist U.S., fighting protectionism with protectionism doesn't work. We are the smaller partner, and we have to work in a new reality in a more protectionist United States. Think about U.S. tariffs as equivalent to one of the largest corporate tax hikes in American history. That's what it ultimately does, costs borne by Americans, by American companies. So what do you do in response to that as Canada? You can retaliate. You won't win that battle. We've learned that lesson. So your second best option is to make Canada ultra competitive. We should be doing everything possible right now to position this country as the best destination in the world for new auto investment and new investment writ large in every sector of the Canadian economy. So get rid of redundant, damaging regulations like the EV mandate, address interprovincial trade barriers that make it extremely costly and challenging for large companies to operate across this country, and build out a world-class pitch for new automotive investment. We can do that, and we can do that right now, and we can make Canada more cost competitive than the United States for auto manufacturing. So that's what I would propose we do.
I think I only have 5 seconds left. Thank you very much for your input. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Madame Datro. Madame O'Rourke, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Carr. Mr. Kingston, we're all aware of the strength, productivity, and importance of Canada's auto sector. As you've said, it's more than 100,000 direct jobs, 500,000 indirect jobs. City of Guelph is home to Linamar, Denso, Magna, and that alone is more than 12,000 jobs. So it makes us one of Canada's most vulnerable cities to U.S. tariffs. So I'm acutely aware of the challenges in the auto sector and its importance. You just mentioned that we should build out a world-class pitch. And I'm wondering, in the last several years, we've had extraordinary investments by Volkswagen, significant investments by Stellantis. And so we know what the strength is of our sector. We know how qualified our auto workers are, how effective our plants are, because that's what's attracting that foreign direct investment. That's what's attracting new lines to Canadian factories. And so I'm wondering if you could help us understand a bit of the history on what was working so well pre-January 2025 and to what you would squarely attribute the industry's current challenges.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think sometimes, given all the uncertainty in the sector right now, we forget about the success of the past 5 years. $40 billion plus in new investment into the Canadian automotive industry, and a large reason for that was because President Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, which had measures that were explicitly aimed at taking components of the automotive supply chain from Canada, from other countries, and putting them into the United States. The federal government reacted aggressively and reacted quickly to put forward matching programs to ensure that we maintained our footprint. And we saw a huge reinvestment in the sector, historically large. So that was working. The plan was working, and it was linked, of course, to our critical mineral production and supply chain. What changed is that we now have a U.S. administration that is doubling down on some of those protectionist measures and is intent on securing more investment in the United States.
Certainly. Mr. Adams or Mr. Williams, would you care to expand on that description of what was the real strength, what remains the real strength of the sector? Because our auto workers are going to work every day and assembling world-class vehicles and making world-class parts. What's really led us to today?
I'll just make one comment to say, yep, David, if I could. So one of the things that flagged for committee members is this organization named CAPSI, which is the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. So it is a industry partnership between the federal government, the Ontario government, and the Quebec government, which has for 25 years focused on getting investment into the country. It has all the CEOs of all the Canadian-made manufacturers sit as members of that. The parts makers, CEOs, the car dealers are there. We've had a long history of supporting investment here in Canada on the dealer side of the equation. That was started as, a bipartisan, the late Jim Flaherty, when he was minister in Ontario, with Alan Rock at the time. And I think that's been a success model, but we really need to have that CAPSI on steroids, if you will. It has to do more and it has to do faster when we're under fire from the U.S. administration. David, over to you.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe add to that. It's mentioned in terms of CAPSI is a great entity, but I think the reality is it's got vested interest companies around the table. And I think what I was suggesting in my comments was having some outside expertise really take a good hard look at the automotive industry as quickly as we can and set up the plan that Mr. Kingston referred to in terms of trying to figure out how we can market that plan moving forward. I think when you ask what else has worked, I think the theory at both levels of government in Ontario and federally was to work at securing the automotive manufacturing footprint, which is key because everything else derives from having that automotive manufacturing footprint. So we saw that in terms of some of the announcements to transition these facilities to producing EVs, for instance. And then the next tier of that was the battery facilities, with the assumption that everything else, I guess, upstream would come along. But that hasn't come along, and that's where we need a lot of focus and attention to ensure, as I mentioned in my remarks, that that critical mineral strategy to develop these critical minerals that aren't only important for the automotive industry, are also critically important to the United States for their defense industry and those types of things. So that represents a real opportunity for us moving forward.
So, Mr. Adams, if I can just follow up on that question. Given the importance of the battery sector, given Canada's role in terms of a leadership position, in terms of starting battery production domestically, having that value chain, it sounds to me like this was a really important investment in Canada that remains useful in terms of dual use potential. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think all of us probably, I can only speak for myself, but I think all of us would probably agree that the future of the automotive industry is electrified. I think where the challenge becomes is how quickly we're going to be able to get there and what tools are being utilized to move us there. And at the end of the day, the one deciding factor in all of this is the consumer. The consumer has to be willing to purchase the vehicles that are being made at our factories. And I don't think anybody ever expected that this transition was going to be easy and simple adoption curve year after year rising EV sales, for instance. We always knew it was going to be lumpy, and I think what we're facing right now is this has been exacerbated by other challenges going on in the United States through their own environmental policies that they're adjusting as well.
Thanks.
Oh, am I out of time?
You are,
Okay, I
but
got more.
fortunately, you've got more. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Salutations.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations for your good presentations, and thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is on a topic that's been talked about quite a bit recently. The federal government had a subsidy program for the purchase of EVs. How it works is when the consumer buys a vehicle, an EV, the Canadian government will receive a request from the manufacturer or the sales authority to get that money. So there's a bit of lost opportunity here. I think perhaps we could try to see what the government might do. Has the government committed to refunding you that credit? Have you received any credits to date? Thank you for the question. I'll give the floor to Charles. But first of all, the program, the dealers are quite engaged in this, that 100%, in fact, with the program. Well, to repeat a little bit here, yes, we've been reimbursed. The dealerships have been reimbursed. And also, I think this is known to everyone, thanks to the pressures put on by members of Parliament, including the Bloc. But once properly implemented, it worked very well. If we take a look in the future for this, it's had an impact. Well, the dealership was bearing the burden initially, and the targets that were set were pretty severe given the competitive nature of dealerships. So the implementation of that program was looked forward to. So, in brief, yes, we were reimbursed, and we thank you for that. My further questions are for Mr. Kingston. The reason that we launched this review, it's the fact that Stellantis has displaced from Brampton, but they're not going to close, apparently. They're going to provide in future another project. We hope to ensure that the number of employees will remain the same.
Do I? And what we'll need to see, of course, is progress on the trade front, and in particular with CUSMA. We need market certainty so that companies can continue with investments. And when you think about an automotive plant like what we have in Brampton or in other parts of the country, these are long-term investments. These are huge plants, and companies intend to have them here for decades. So we need certainty on the trade front, and then companies can proceed with decisions with respect to the Canadian footprint. But as long as that uncertainty hangs over the economy, it will make it very challenging.
OK. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. When we saw the announcement that they were going to move the assembly into Illinois, are North American manufacturers reviewing the supply chains in order to ensure that vehicles sold on the American market no longer depend on parts manufactured in Canada? it's a long-term project, as you know, as was said, to develop the infrastructure in the plant, etc. So for those individuals that you represent, are they aware of this, and are they actually working on that transfer?
That's not happening. We deal regularly, weekly, with our counterparts in the United States, and the message that's being delivered consistently is that we exist as an industry, are competitive as an industry because of the North American supply chain. You cannot change that overnight. You cannot change that in the course of one presidential term. You know, the cost of moving manufacturing outright from Canada and Mexico to the United States, finding the employees, building the facilities, getting the utilities hooked up. This would be a multi-decade project, and it would cost far, far too much. It would also reduce the economies of scale. This industry is competitive because you build and sell into a market of 20 million customers, 20 million vehicle sales. So that is the objective of everybody in the automotive industry, and I remain confident and optimistic for some of the reasons that Mr. Williams pointed out, that there's a deal to be had here. It works to the benefit of all.
OK, merci. Il me reste peu de temps. Dernière question, très rapide. Selon ma lecture, les tarifs du président Trump, sauf pour l'acier et l'aluminium qui remontent au décret de son premier mandat, les tarifs sont illégaux. Les tarifs doivent être adoptés par les deux chambres. Est-ce que...
Monsieur Saint-Marie, malheureusement, il n'y a pas de traduction.
Try again. Are your counterparts, American, are taking steps to ensure that these illegal tariffs are dropped, eliminated, so that the supply chain will function properly?
Yes, absolutely.
Ms. Borelli, 5 minutes to you.
Mr. Kingston, you've warned that the government's EV mandate that has a $20,000 penalty per gas-powered vehicle over the limit is driving investment away. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Carney has said Canadians must sacrifice during this transformation. It baffles me that the Liberal government solutions for these thousands of workers in Windsor, Brampton, and Oshawa, who are already losing their livelihoods, are being told that they're the ones who must continue to sacrifice, while government policy actively drives industry out of Canada. In your expert opinion, what policy changes need to happen to secure our jobs and the long-term functioning of our industry here in Canada?
Repeal the EV mandate. It could be done today, and it would have an immediate benefit to the automotive industry. Under the mandate, if companies don't hit the mandated targets, they have two options. One is to purchase credits from other companies, notably companies that are not invested here in Canada. Our estimate is that will cost the industry about $3.6 billion between now and 2030, or pull vehicles from the market, 700 to 900,000 new vehicle sales pulled from the Canadian market every single year, which for a Canadian customer looking to buy a car means that there will be less on the lot and the prices will be higher. So at a time where the pressure on the industry is originating from U.S. trade policy, let's not do, it's effectively an own goal. There's no other way to put it. Like we can provide relief to the sector, but instead we're keeping this punitive regulation in place, which is highly costly at the worst possible time.
Thank you. You're leading into my next question already. So 700,000 cars pulled off lots every year? My goodness. In a time when owning a car is a luxury, do you believe that this government is forcing wasteful habits that are only hurting our economy instead of growing it? And where do all those cars go?
Yeah.
If I may, thank you for the question. So dealers are on the front lines of this. I mean, I've said it publicly and I've said it privately. I say the same thing in private as I say in public on all of this, is that rich people are still going to be able, if they keep the EV mandate, rich people are still going to be able to afford cars. It's rural Canadians, Canadians from middle-class backgrounds that won't be able to afford cars. There's only two ways that we can, that, you know, the auto sector and dealers will have this managed for them by manufacturers. You either pay the $20,000 per vehicle, or you just sell less cars. Our dealers are worried sick that the global manufacturers, to meet these targets, are just going to put less cars in the marketplace. When you have fewer cars in the marketplace, there's less choice for consumers, prices go up, and you can get the calculation for rural Canadians and Canadians from middle-class backgrounds. So the whole thing is a pending disaster. And what's worse about it, and I can be maybe a little bit more direct than Mr. Kingston or Mr. Adams on this, is you've got two other governments that have EV mandates. You've got the BC government and you've got the Quebec government. They've all told us that they're waiting for the federal government to move so that they can get rid of the mandates there, because they know they won't work. I mean, everybody knows they won't work. I support the intentions behind this. Dealers support electric vehicles. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars. Each dealer's put in more than $1 million to have the lifts, the charging infrastructure put in their dealership. But what we can have is a system that just subsidizes Tesla. You mentioned, Mr. St. Marie, that they get a subsidy on the front end of the purchase of the vehicle, but they also get a subsidy from all the other manufacturers who have to buy credits for them. If you want to help Tesla and not your local car dealer, keep the EV mandate.
Do I have time left? Okay, Mr. Adams, with Canada's light-duty vehicle production down 66% since 2015 and Stellantis redirecting production to the U.S., do you believe Canada has lost its credibility as a stable investment partner? And what concrete reforms would restore confidence among global manufacturers? Lower taxes, faster approval, or simply a government that keeps its word?
I think those last two things that you mentioned are part and parcel of an overall broader strategy to continue to attract investment, in terms of, if we're going to look at exploring our EV sector, then we need faster approvals to get product out of the ground. 15 years is too long to open a mine. Regulatory redundancy across the country is challenging for all industries, not the least of which is the automotive industry. So those are a couple of things that need to be done as well. But none of this, in a way, is going to make that much difference if we can't go back to the original premise here of, we do need to ensure that we work to secure our trade arrangement with the United States, not only in the short term with the 232 tariffs, but also in the longer term through the review of the CUSMA USMCA.
Thanks, Ms. Borelli. Madame O'Rourke, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Carr. So just for clarification, the EV mandate is currently paused and will not apply to 2026 models and is under review. And so the Government of Canada has heard the concerns of the sector and understands that the context has changed. I would say there's over 110 EV models available in Canada. And actually, Mr. Adams, your members are actually leading in this space with very high percentages of EV and plug-in electric hybrid sales, so I appreciate that. So we all want to see those Section 232 tariffs removed. We all want to see CUSMA renegotiated to get back to a healthy relationship. You know, we're undergoing a study on productivity. None of this is productive. I'll just come back to a statement Ms. Borelli made around Canada being a stable investment partner. Would you not agree that it is the United States' imposition of tariffs that are creating the instability in the current market?
I'm happy to take that question. Yeah, I mean, totally the instability, this trade rupture is driven by one place, and we all know the destination of this. And just on the EV mandate, because I'm so passionate about it, we're appreciative of the pause and 60-day consultation. But I can tell you, and again, I say the same thing privately as I say publicly. I met with officials from Environment Canada on Friday, and they don't seem like they've read the entire playbook. So, and so, I think this really behooves, members of Parliament, the political level, to understand it. And I think your point is also well taken. We should plant a flag on the success of this. I mean, there used to be a challenge in terms of models available. Over 100 models available. Consumers are taking the Canadians up on this. They're charging forward on this. And the adoption is happening. The technology is there. We need better charging infrastructure. We need to take into account Canada's climate. But mandates aren't the way to do it. Our dealers tell me all the time, don't be anti-EV, because we're not.
On my time.
Please, sorry.
To focus on the purpose of this study. Because what is happening in the auto sector is a concern that we all share, and I appreciate the comments you made, Mr. Kingston, around we need collaboration here. So one of the things that has been very successful in helping Canadian auto manufacturers is the Strategic Investment Fund. One of you, in your remarks, indicated that that is based on production. I'm wondering if you can tell me generally how important are these investments, and to the degree that you can, how are they usually structured?
Sure, I can start. So it depends on the company and the agreement, but in response to the Inflation Reduction Act, there were a number of policies. So you have the SIF program run through ISED, which helps with CapEx. So when a company is retooling a plant, building a new plant, they can access that fund. But what we saw in response to what the U.S. had done, because the U.S. introduced production credits, and basically as in an effort to pull investment into the United States, if you build a battery in the U.S., you would get a credit every single battery that rolled off the line. So we saw, in addition to some of the traditional sort of support for CapEx, these additional production supports. I just want to note for the record here that sometimes the numbers that government has committed to this get overinflated because they're based on an assumption that companies were going to build plants on time and manufacture to the maximum. Given what has happened to the EV market, which is a near collapse, no one is producing at those levels. So the amount of production subsidy that would go to companies in the battery supply chain is far, far below what was anticipated. But they were very critical to securing investment in Canada because the IRA was trying to draw that away.
Terrific. Thank you. I just want to clarify as well to Ms. Borelli's point, the only broken promise here was on the part of Stellantis and not on the part of the Government of Canada. So I'd like to move on. We know that there are a number of government supports in place for workers in the sector. It includes trades training, the Regional Tariff Response Initiative, which is $6.5 billion in new measures to protect Canadian businesses and workers, and of course those ongoing negotiations for sectoral deals and also CUSMA. How important are these measures, and what other actions, if any, can the Canadian government take to stabilize the investment environment in the Canadian auto sector?
I could start and just say I think all of those actions are very important, and I think the reality is that we are in a very difficult situation, and we're playing poker with maybe not the best cards, but I think the reality is that we do have cards to play. And I think Mr. Kingston or Mr. Williams pointed out that the Canadian market, 40% of our sales in the Canadian market are American-built vehicles. So that presumably should come into part of the dialogue when we're talking with the U.S. administration about how we're going to structure a trade deal, if there's one to be had, with the United States or between the two nations. And I would go back to the other effort that needs to be made is it's clear the United States does not care very much about Canada or Canada's automotive industry, but what we need to underscore for the U.S. is that the competitiveness of their own industry is dependent on having that integrated North American market with Canada and the U.S. as vital partners in that arrangement.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 2 minutes, 30 secondes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thanks again, Chair. I understand that not so much that the tariffs are going to be there for long term. We're doing everything possible not to drop the ball and make sure that we have true free trade with the United States, particularly for the auto sector. However, my question, perhaps beginning with Mr. Kingston, if current tariffs stay put for the long term, will we find ourselves in the situation prior to 1965, the same models assembled on each side of the border were higher for the consumers and fewer choices for the consumer?
Excellent question, and it really gets to the heart of why we have the CUSMA agreement. Prior to that, NAFTA, and before that, the Canada-U.S. FTA. There was a recognition that protectionism is actually bad for consumers. And so when you divvy up markets and you make production be hyper-locally focused, it means that the consumer has less choice, less access to new technology, and ultimately faces higher prices. So if you play this out, and let's presume we are going to a permanently more protectionist world, that is what you could result in. You'd have economies closed off from each other, and you build in market to service the market. I ultimately don't think that's where we're going, because I just know that a $188 billion tariff cost is going to hurt the American consumer. You're going to see vehicle prices go up $4,000, $12,000, $15,000 US dollars. I don't think people signed up for that. It takes time, though, for that to work through the system. So that is a potential outcome, but I ultimately think we will find a landing zone. And the key for Canada is to always be relatively better positioned than any other country in the world in terms of our access to the U.S., and that's what we need to focus on.
Merci beaucoup. Il reste 30 secondes. Est-ce que
I have 30.
Williams ou M. Adams voulait commenter?
Oui, what we've seen in the market with actual car dealerships is actually sales have been very positive because people are afraid of the tariffs, so they've been buying forward on the tariffs as opposed to not. So it's going to take some time to work that out. And I'll just say from a political point of view, I mean, we've done a lot of work in Washington, as I said before. You know, there's a lack of courage in Congress at the moment on the Republican side to speak out against the administration, but they're aware of the problems on a state-by-state basis.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Currently, manufacturers are still at full production, but the tariffs continue to bite, and they're largely absorbing the tariffs right now. But that, as more time goes by, that becomes a continually unsustainable proposition.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gugelmin, 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. A lot of what's been discussed with respect to tariffs and other market conditions is this fact of certainty being required for investment. Just out of curiosity, Mr. Kingston, from your perspective, does a pause on the EV mandates give enough certainty for the attraction of investment dollars in the sector?
No, it doesn't. We appreciate that the government recognized there is an issue here, but the way the mandate works is that a one-year pause doesn't change the fact that companies have to contract for credits out to 2035 because they have to make sure they have the certainty they can still operate in this market. So the pause hasn't provided any additional certainty. And to Mr. Williams' point, what we're hearing from ECCC is concerning at this stage.
And I would imagine if the government was listening to the industry, they would remove the EV mandates altogether.
It is a simple action that could be taken immediately that would provide significant relief now.
Thank you. Mr. Adams, you've spoken about duplicative regulations, and we've heard at this committee from others who have said there's some 105,000 different regulations on the manufacturing sector. So could you give an example of how this duplication is adding cost or discouraging investment for some of your members?
It might seem like a trite example, but there's a lot of regulatory authority that's been given to the provinces as well. Some of the Western provinces require little mud flaps on the vehicle, and you would think that each province would have a standardized mud flap that would be required on vehicles, but they don't. So every manufacturer has to deal with different provincial requirements for mud flaps because of gravel roads and that sort of thing. Tiny example. There's another larger example in terms of stewardship programs for things like batteries and tires and those sorts of things. We have umpteen, I think there's 85 different programs that impact the automotive industry, and these stewardship programs add cost and duplication. There's no harmony that exists. And the last one, which has already been referred to and relevant to the point that was just made, with our EV mandates, we've got a federal mandate and we've got 2 provincial mandates that are in place that are similar, trying to achieve the same goal, but very different penalty structures and whatnot as well.
Thank you. Mr. Adams, from a global perspective, again, we're talking a lot about how we need to create the conditions, the environmental conditions for business investment to be attractive and for it to flourish. I know Mr. Kingston in his opening remarks was very much talking about the business climate and competitiveness here in Canada. So I was just wondering how you felt Canada compares to peer jurisdictions when it comes to things like regulations, tax environment, and clarity for investment attractiveness.
Yeah, I mean, there's always room for improvement, but I think the reality is if you look back to the comments earlier in the conversation about attracting EV investment, for instance, 25 billion of the 40-odd billion came from my member companies into Canada. So Canada, I think, did a reasonably good job at actually they over-vectored on attracting that investment compared to our percentage of the North American content. So I think we've done a reasonably good job. Could we do better? Well, sure, we could always do better. And I think regulatory redundancy, building a competitive tax framework, and as I said in my remarks, having a comprehensive strategy around our industry is very important.
So, Mr. Kingston, in light of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill and some of the other very, I guess, aggressive changes the U.S. is making to policy to attract investment and really like things like 100% write-offs for R&D and other tax incentives. Do you think currently our government's doing enough to align with U.S. industrial and trade policies to keep investment here in Canada, especially given the new climate that we're in?
No, we can and must do more. If you think back to the first Trump administration and the tax cuts that were brought in by the United States, government reacted and did the right thing. We had accelerated capital cost allowance, other measures that were put in, then the IRA, and now we have the second Trump administration with the Big Beautiful Bill. In every instance, Canada is reacting to U.S. policy changes. I'd like to see a world in which Canada has a proactive plan with a simple mission. Let's be the most competitive economy in the world and do whatever it takes to build that out so that when there are changes in the United States, it doesn't concern us because we are hyper competitive. So I think there's a lot we can do, and now is the time. Now we should be having those conversations and making those hard choices to improve the tax system and improve our regulatory environment.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Madame O'Rourke, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Carr. Really fascinating, Mr. Adams, about the interprovincial trade barriers. I'd be interested in hearing more about that because the federal government has removed all its federal interprovincial trade barriers, and I think that it would be incumbent upon us to urge the provinces to do the same. I just want to make the record clear that foreign direct investment was a record $85 billion last year. Again, it brings us back to this conclusion that the challenges that we're facing in this moment, they are not of the federal government's doing, but they are rather the imposition of these unjustified tariffs by the Americans. So, Mr. Adams, I was really intrigued by your proposal of having a royal commission that could look at other strengths of the sector, and I'm wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Just to say, there were problems back in the late 50s and early 60s where we weren't able to optimize our automotive industry. We had very high tariff walls coming into Canada, and we had very costly vehicles in Canada as a result. And I think that's what led to ultimately to the Auto Pact, which resulted into the economies of scale of being able to produce in both countries for either country when producing those vehicles together. But I think the reality is that we, as I mentioned in my remarks, we have a lot of different subsectors to our industry that weren't present back in the 1960s. And I think the key is how do we look at the industry holistically and figure out, well, how are we going to encompass a critical mineral strategy, connected automated vehicles, cybersecurity, which are all part and parcel of the modern vehicle. And I don't think anybody has really given any holistic thought to that. And that Canada has some real strengths in that. If that's going to be part of our automotive industry going forward, then those are areas that we can capitalize on.
Thank you. And I just was curious to know what else you think the federal government should be doing in terms of encouraging those types of investments. And thank you to your members who really have been leading here. In order to stabilize the footprint in Canada, and also to Mr. Kingston and perhaps Mr. Williams, even if the federal government brought in a number of these other measures, what do you think should be in place to ensure that your members uphold their commitments?
In terms of ensuring that we have a compelling case here and continue to attract investment. The critical mineral supply chain, I know Mr. Adams mentioned it, but despite the challenges in the EV sector right now, this is the future. And China controls 80% of the battery supply chain. They also control 90% of rare earth minerals. I just came from Saguenay, where they have the ability to process gallium. Like, there are minerals that we have that you cannot get anywhere else in the world. So I think if we accelerate our efforts to identify those key minerals and build out the processing capacity, not only is that good for the auto supply chain, but it also gives Canada leverage in these broader discussions with the United States. With respect to covenants in these agreements, the companies have lived up to their covenants in the agreements. As I noted at the outset, Stellantis, of the $8 billion it's committed to Canada, $7 billion has put into effect. These are massive investments that have been made. A third shift in Windsor. Nexstar battery plant, the first large-scale battery plant, fully in operation with 1,000 new jobs. So these investments are happening, but companies have to adjust to the current trade environment.
Yeah, and I would just say from a dealer perspective, we put out the competitiveness framework, so credit where credit is due, the pause of the EV mandate we called for, and then a full reset, which I think you've heard my case on that. We also, the banks in this country have been lobbying to have the right to lease vehicles, which they've been prohibited for since the beginning of time. There's a specific prohibition in the Bank Act. The discussions with finance, I think, are in a good place, and we expect an announcement in the budget, hopefully soon. The luxury tax, I think removal of that, we have been clear on that. Harmonization of standards with those that we have a free trade agreement, that's not going to happen overnight, but that's, it helps to expand the marketplace. And I know not every manufacturer is on the same page with respect to that. And one of the things we called for was the IZEV repayment, and that happened to 100%. In terms of interprovincial trade barriers, the PPSA, which is the personal property securitization that's done each province, it's a mess at the moment. It's not correct, and you have little anomalies, for example, that make a big difference for customer affordability. Is if in the Atlantic province, for instance, is if the customer's name is Jean, but his driver's license or his legal name is John, and there's a mismatch. The car company or the dealer who has the loan on that, in the case of a bankruptcy, loses their place to secure that credit, which is just again an anti-competitive thing that we've got to correct.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, so what we're going to do here is suspend for about 5 minutes just to give everybody an opportunity to stretch their legs a little bit, and then we will return for about 45, 50 minutes to resume our line of questioning. Suspended. stretch their legs. We're going to get back into our line of questioning. Because it's a continuation of the, just for members, of the same round, instead of going to the 6 minutes, 5, and then 5, it's going to be 5, 5, 2.5, 5, 5. In other words, it's just a slight reduction for each party. Having said that, Mr. Falk, I have you as the first on my list for the Conservative Party, so there will be 5 minutes for you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony this morning. It's been very enlightening so far. You know, earlier we heard Mrs. O'Rourke say that the only promise broken here has been by Stellantis. Can any of you respond to the promise that was made by Mark Carney that there would be a trade deal by July 21st?
To handle this question, which I'm happy to. Listen, and again, I have to say the same thing privately as I do publicly. You know, I think we're dealing with a very mercurial trade partner. I think the Prime Minister has done a lot of things right, and I've said that on CTV News, and I've given President credit to Premier Ford at times, who's taken a slightly different strategy. But we're dealing with a very different organization. I'll also say this. When we were in Washington in the second or third week of July, senior senators who are very close to President Trump, whom I won't name to avoid causing disruption, told us in private meetings that we would have a deal just after Labor Day. So they're as surprised in Congress as we are. You know, there's been a number of sliding scales. There's been a number of anticipated deals on 232 tariffs that have not materialized. So I would just say this. I think that from an industry standpoint, who are plugged in the States and active in the States, it is a roller coaster ride.
But we also know that $60 billion of Canadian investment has left Canada for other places, primarily the United States. On Mr. Carney's last visit to the President, he promised to bring back a deal as well. And instead, he promised the Americans $500 billion of investment. What does your industry think about that?
I can tell you, I'm not sure if the others want to jump in here, but there's a few dynamics that we're worried about. I mean, a number of our dealers, represent Ford, GM, and Stellantis. These are Canadian companies as much as they are American companies, and they worry about the knock-on effect of being seen as too American. So that's definitely a concern. And again, we're concerned about getting a long-term deal. Yes, we need a short-term certainty, but the big prize out here is to make sure we have a USMCA or CUSMA deal. That's what we're really concerned about.
You've all commented on the fact that you need certainty, and certainly I can appreciate that. You can't make billion-dollar decisions without that certainty, and that's something that you've been lacking here. With only a pause on the EV market, that doesn't give you certainty, and I understand that. And you've all articulated that the EV mandate has to go. So one of my, and you've also, I think, Mr. Kingston, you said the EV market is near collapse. Do you have the stats for Canada? What percentage of new vehicles were EVs?
Yeah, so we've seen 7 months now of decline in EV sales. Unprecedented, no sign of recovery. We're currently through August sitting at 8.8% of all new vehicles sold are zero-emission vehicles, and the 2026 mandated target is 20%, and then that rises up to 60%. And again, just to be clear, the manufacturers are fully invested in EVs and have introduced more models than ever, sitting at 115 models in market. But you can't, if a consumer doesn't want the vehicle and they're choosing another technology, it doesn't matter how many models you have available. You need the organic consumer demand, and that's what we're missing at the moment.
How much time? A minute? Okay. So, yes.
I know we have the member for Oakville here. So I think, one of the cases that I would make, if you look at the recent registrations, in Oakville, you're just about 15%, 4.7%. Oakville's a great community. A lot of consumers are choosing that as their second vehicle to have an EV, and they might, for larger, trips to hockey tournaments, have a pickup truck or something that fits the marketplace. In Thunder Bay, I think we're at 2.1%, 3% in Greater Sudbury. I mean, it's a different. We can't have one mandate for the entire country, and I think there's a recognition that we need certainty on the mandate. I take your point, and getting rid of the mandate will help investment.
Limited amount of time.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Stellantis was building an EV charger, a complete flop. They have made a corporate decision to move back to gasoline-powered, which is what the market is demanding. Is that accurate?
They're still building electric charger. They're also bringing a gas-powered version as well, and they have, of course, the battery plant in Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. Mr. Bardisi, 5 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Just want to start with a question for Mr. Adams. I know some of this predates your arrival in the chair that you occupy, but can you just share a bit about what attracted some of your members, or two of your members in particular, to set up manufacturing and assembly operations in Canada?
Well, it was my understanding is it was a collection of different measures. So there was concern about the Japanese coming into the market at the time. There were different measures that were put in place to try and limit the penetration of the Canadian market by the Japanese. The same held true in the United States. As a result of those measures, the Japanese were convinced to actually build production in Canada. So Honda was the first manufacturer to set up production here in 1984, I believe, followed by Toyota in 1986. And over the course of time, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, they've become, at this point anyway, the two largest vehicle manufacturers in Canada.
And to what extent does having a skilled workforce, is it important for those member companies?
Well, having a skilled workforce is very important, and when those companies came here, they also brought along with them some of their part suppliers, dedicated part suppliers as well, that then went on to also serve other components of the automotive industry, some of Mr. Kingston's members as well. So having a skilled workforce has actually been demonstrated in the awards that my two members have received for quality, build quality, gold, silver, platinum awards from J.D. Power, for instance, and other organizations recognizing globally the quality of those plants. And I think that becomes a consideration when these companies are looking at where am I going to put my next investment. So having the certainty that we've all talked about is important, but having these other, I guess, maybe more peripheral aspects are very important as well.
A question for any of the panelists. It's not just federal policy. There's also provincial policy that's had a change recently with two provinces changing their incentive programs. To what extent do you think provincial policy choices are also explaining this slight decline in electric vehicle sales?
I would go back to even before the two provinces. If you will recall, perhaps, I think you were in the Ontario government at the time, Mr. Bardisi, that Ontario had a $14,000 incentive, and we saw EV sales really bottom out substantially once that incentive went away. And I think we look at this current situation that we're in, we have a zero-emission vehicle mandate, but it's also sort of predicated on having the zero-emission vehicle, the IZEV program in place, so incentives to assist consumers to purchase these vehicles, and also having a robust build-out of the charging infrastructure. Right now, we need 40,000 pieces of charging infrastructure installed every year to meet the government's own estimates, and we're nowhere near that. So those two things are faltering while we still have the requirements of the zero-emission vehicle mandate.
But one aspect of charging infrastructure is that it's more of a national presence, is more of a national footprint for the sector. So would it be fair to say that the growth of EVs over the longer period have kind of positive economic spillovers at broader parts of Canada?
Well, I think from my perspective anyway, that development, long-term development of the EV sector holds out that promise as opposed to just being an Ontario proposition. Certainly we've seen just from some of the investments that already have been made and proposed investments, Quebec played a big factor in that. We've got minerals out in the Midwest and also in BC. So there is the opportunity to have a more comprehensive automotive sector in Canada as we develop those critical minerals.
And maybe just to stick with you, Mr. Adams, some of your members, one of your members, Toyota Canada, their August 2025 sales were up 14.4% year over year, with electrified vehicles representing 49.1% of all units sold. So what is it about the shift to EV over the longer term that you think is attracting Toyota?
Well, I think Toyota has actually been criticized by some of the environmental zealots for not moving fast enough on EVs, and I think this is part of the challenge for all manufacturers. Is that I would come back to what's the goal? What's the government's goal? Is it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or is it to put a certain type of product on the road? And I think my members generally, especially the Japanese, are very thoughtful. Not to say that others aren't, but very deliberate in terms of thinking through things before they act, but when they act, they move with swiftness. What I can say is just right now, Toyota, to your point, significant production increase, and or sales increase, and they've also will be moving to add RAV4, the 2026 RAV4 hybrid production that will be coming out in Woodstock and Cambridge in December.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burgundy. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Oui, merci. Pour les trois organisations.
Yes, question for all three of the organizations. We've seen the United States president is very angry because he doesn't agree that Ronald Reagan was against tariffs. Now, but he hasn't written any official increase yet. So what would be the cost if he does sign an executive order?
I mean, look, it would be extremely challenging if more tariffs go into place, particularly if they apply to product that currently qualify under USMCA. So we don't know yet how these will be applied, but an additional 10% is, again, it will be billions in dollars in cost onto this sector and onto other Canadian sectors. So very damaging, and hopefully we can find an off-ramp.
Well, quickly, I might add, like Ben mentioned, we have no clue really exactly when, if these will be imposed, tariff that is, but the cost of living will go up, obviously, because it's already getting pretty bad with these tariffs. Monthly payments, for example, in 21, $415, and now it's $880, $890 for a monthly payment on a vehicle. That's a very negative impact on consumers. So 10% more would only exacerbate the situation further. Would the other witness care to address us on how that tariff would?
Colleagues, that we don't know what it's going to be applicable to yet, and I think the reality for the automotive sector is because of the CUSMA USMCA, we have had some of the tariff impact ameliorated because the American content in vehicles built in Canada is considered, but it just shows you, again, the lack of certainty that we're dealing with when, a comment can be made one night to increase tariffs. What tariff, when, we don't know those details.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Dancho, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to focus a little bit more on what we need for certainty. And again, I think the point that Mr. Falk was making is well placed, that there were big promises made by the Carney government over the last election when Canadians were going to the polls. Big promises about deals being made. We heard over and over again that something was going to happen in September or in the summer. That didn't happen. Mr. Williams, you alluded to something was supposed to happen around Labor Day weekend. That didn't happen. So very big promises were made that would have delivered certainty had they come through. And unfortunately, Mr. Carney's promises did not come to fruition. So it does add to the uncertainty that your your businesses are experiencing. And Mr. Kingston, you did mention regarding the Brampton plant, first you had said that there are plans for Brampton. I appreciate that. But later you had said that, quote, we need market certainty so that companies can continue with investments. When you think about an automotive plant like we have in Brampton, these are long-term investments. So we need certainty on the trade front, and then companies can proceed with decisions with respect to the Canadian footprint. But as long as that uncertainty hangs over, it will make it very challenging. So to me, that sounds like you're saying there could be plans for Brampton if we get a deal, not just any deal, but a good deal for us to stay with Brampton. Is that an accurate assessment of what you've said collectively?
Yeah, so Brampton is not closed, and the company does have plans for that plant. But yes, we do need clarity in terms of what the trade environment is going to look like.
If we don't get a deal, a long promised deal that has yet to come from Mr. Carney and the Liberal government, if we don't get one, then are you saying that in a year from now, if all things are the same, Brampton, you're not going to have anything moving there, or just looking for a clear answer?
Well, I don't want to make a judgment call on a hypothetical, but look, if we don't get a trade agreement with the United States, it won't just be the auto industry that is in dire straits. The whole Canadian economy will be at risk. So.
Certainly, no, I appreciate that. And again, as I mentioned, I think we welcome, there's been rumors about a potential steel and aluminum deal, which of course are inputs into cars, so that would be great, but there's still no deliverables yet on that. But we have not heard that same emphasis from the Liberal government about the auto sector. So that's just very concerning to us. For all the workers that are waiting, we need that certainty, and I'm sure you would all agree. So hopefully we can have a bit of a reset from the Liberals and have them publicly say and work on it behind the scenes that they're working to get an auto deal, because we have not heard that so far. So based on what you've said, that doesn't bode well for what we're seeing in Brampton. I did want to just change gears a little bit and focus on Mr. Williams. You had mentioned in some of your remarks, these EV mandates in essence is money going from Canada to companies like Tesla. Can you just, for someone who's maybe not familiar of how the mandate works, are you saying that the Liberal government's EV mandate enriches companies like Tesla rather than our own?
Yeah, Tesla is the only car company operating in Canada that doesn't use a dealer network. So all of our dealers are independently owned franchises. We buy the cars from the manufacturers in advance, pay for them, and then hope to sell them to consumers. So we're on the hook for all of that. Tesla has a direct-to-consumer model, and they are the biggest beneficiary and have been the biggest beneficiary. They get the subsidy on the front end from the IZEV subsidy, as every manufacturer does, but then to be able to buy credits to meet the mandate, other manufacturers are to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars buying credits for a future EV mandate from Tesla. So Tesla's getting paid on both ends of it, and we don't have to look too far to know how productive they are in terms of the Canada-U.S. relationship.
So that's pretty shocking to me to understand that this EV mandate, although I recognize it's temporarily paused, it's still hanging over everybody's head. And what we've heard clearly today, that is the last thing we need for investment certainty into Canada, given everything else that's going on. And very clearly, you've all outlined, or for the most part outlined, that if we could do away with the mandate, that would provide a little bit more certainty for us that we desperately need in this country. We're bleeding automotive jobs here, and not just the direct jobs, but all the indirect jobs. I believe the Brampton plant, for example, is responsible for 12,000 indirect jobs that play into that plant. So having things like this hang over our heads, I think, is pretty significant. And now, Mr. Williams, you're saying, and I think what you're saying is accurate, that not only is the EV mandate driving uncertainty, but it is also enriching companies like Tesla that really don't employ anyone in Canada. Is that accurate?
Well, I think Canadians would be shocked by the shell game that Tesla's benefiting from of subsidies on both ends of the equation. It's shocking. We find it shocking.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you very much. So again, I'll just allow a last 20 seconds. We'll go to Mr. Kingston on the certainty side. How important it is for our job certainty in Canada that we get a deal?
It's critical. It's at the center of everything. If we don't get a trade agreement with the Americans, there's no certainty for existing or future investment decisions in the Canadian economy. So we have no choice. We have to get back to the table and strike a deal.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Baines, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today, and thank you for your hard work fighting for this industry and for the families that are impacted by it. I'll go to Mr. Williams if I can. Just on the issue of EV mandates, you indicated my home province, British Columbia, hasn't paused the EV mandate, whereas the federal government has. Have you had conversations with them? What are the dealers in BC's thoughts on this, and why is BC not following suit to support the industry like the federal government is and the Prime Minister is?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think between yourself and the member from Vaughan, you probably have the most car dealers in your riding than any jurisdiction in Canada, with Richmond Auto Mall and others. So appreciate the question. I think, again, our dealers in British Columbia are selling a ton of EVs. It's a very popular product in Vancouver. But even the BC government won't meet their mandates. And also having 3 mandates, one in Quebec, one in BC, one nationally, is a nightmare from a compliance point of view. So we have met with the minister, the provincial government out there. They have a very interesting dynamic that they would actually have to pass legislation to get rid of it, but they can make adjustments through regulations. And they are, I think, waiting for a signal, is what they've told us from the federal government, that the federal government's going to move on this. And what we want to see from all 3 levels of government, not just the federal government, is plant a flag on EV mandates. They have driven the market, so they have 100 choices out there. It's no longer a consumer cannot find an EV. Work on charging infrastructure, make sure that consumers can charge the vehicles and have a good, positive experience, and then let that drive the market, and it will drive the market. You're seeing that out in BC. It's a very popular program.
Thank you. And now I'm going to cede the rest of my time to my colleague, Ms. Akan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baines. Mr. Adams, through my previous professional life, I had the opportunity to visit several auto manufacturers, both in U.S. and in Canada. And over the summer, my colleagues and I visited plants in Canada as a part of our efforts to better understand the evolving needs of the industry. So in one of the discussions with the leadership of a Canadian auto manufacturing company, I learned that their dealership in South America recently shifted purchasing from United States plant to an Ontario facility, largely due to the impact of the tariffs and the counter tariffs. So would you say this reflects a broader opportunity for Canadian auto workers and manufacturers, where changing global trade dynamics could strengthen Canada's position as a competitive and reliable production hub?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand what you're saying correctly, I know obviously Canadian manufacturing doesn't want to matter which manufacturer is predicated on access to the U.S. market. 90% of our vehicles go there. If we don't have access to the U.S. market, then every company, I'm sure, is doing their due diligence to figure out where else can we potentially have a market for vehicles. And I know one of my member companies, that's exactly what they have been doing. They've been finding some other countries where that some of their Canadian production can go. Will it replace the U.S.? No, and the volumes simply aren't there, but it's an option to take more of that volume that comes out of the Canadian facility.
Thank you. So Canada's industrial strategy has focused not only on final vehicle assembly, but also on strengthening the supply chain that supports it. While we have a robust Tier 1 ecosystem, there's also a growing need to expand domestic capabilities for Tier 2 and Tier 3 in manufacturing. So particularly to support advanced vehicle production and emerging technologies like EV and battery systems. So from the perspective of international and imported automakers, which supplier capabilities do you see as most critical to develop in Canada to ensure long-term competitiveness in the North American auto sector?
Yeah, I think some of the ones that you've mentioned are critical as well in terms of looking at, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think building out the EV supply chain, opening those mines and developing and processing, not shipping away, but processing those critical minerals here, not only for the automotive industry, but for other industries as well. We have a unique situation in Ontario where we have globally recognized IT tech sector combined with an automotive sector. So the capabilities to really be world leaders in connectivity, automated vehicles exist, and cybersecurity, I would add as well. So I think those are areas where we could have a competitive advantage.
Yes, Mr. Kingston.
Just to add to that, because sometimes we do spend a lot of time focusing on final assembly for good reason, because of all the direct and spin-off jobs. But there's a lot of activity that takes place in Ontario. So GM has the technical center in Markham, engineering talent, It is real and it is highly competitive here in Canada and hard to replicate in parts of the United States. Stellantis and Windsor with their ADRC, their research facility. So there are areas in the autonomous connected vehicle space, safety, where activity takes place in Canada because we have a competitive advantage linked to highly skilled labor.
Thanks very much. Mr. Gugelmin, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've been talking a lot about the very serious impact of tariffs, and to me, it's always sort of been the catalyst on the automotive and manufacturing industry. I come from the steel service industry. I worked there for over 20 years, and a lot of what I've been seeing over the last 10 to 15 years or so was a lot of job flight and capital flight out of the manufacturing industry, out of the auto industry, into places like Monterrey, Mexico, into the broader United States. For instance, I know like over a 10-year period between 2014 and 2024, our vehicle production in Canada went down by about 1 million vehicles per year. We have like very costly policies still in place, like the emissions cap, for example, like the fact that it takes 18 years to approve a mine. And we were talking about the importance and the need for critical mineral development in this country so we can facilitate production of EV batteries and things where, you know, China kind of has a monopoly on a lot of this right now. So I was just wondering, maybe Mr. Kingston, I'll keep this to you. How significant is policy misalignment with the U.S.? You know, we've been talking about EV mandates, for example, but like more broadly, like with respect to regulations and taxation and some of these other key factors that are sort of impeding our opportunity to increase our growth in our sector. How significant is that in influencing where automakers are making the choice to invest capital dollars?
It's fundamental. I mean, that is the reason the industry has grown since the Auto Pact and since the 60s. There's been a recognition by successive governments that you have to align your policy framework to the United States because 90% of what we're exporting is going into the U.S. market. There's no such thing as creating a standalone Canadian automotive industry. That wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't be able to achieve economies of scale. So regulatory alignment is key. And it's really fundamental to this sector.
You know, when I remember one of the first stories I heard when I was new in my industry, it was a major parts manufacturing company. And the person was asked, you know, why is it that you're not doing any more expansion in Canada? And the answer was because when you go to other jurisdictions around the world, they seem to roll out the red carpet. And here we roll out the red tape, whether it's through regulation or tax, like strangling through our tax framework and just overall lack of competitiveness. Mr. Williams, question for you. So the U.S. has moved away from aggressive EV sales mandates. Do you think Canada is putting itself at risk for a very competitive disadvantage by continuing down this path?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that the EV mandate makes us less competitive, not just domestically, but it makes us a less attractive market for investment. So, you know, as I believe Mr. Kingston and Mr. Adams have said, you know, we need to have a competitive auto space which matches the regulatory framework of the U.S. I mean, they're just too big to not be aligned. And that doesn't mean we have to pull back on greenhouse gas emissions. The industry can get there with a variety of technology. And just to let members know that over the past 20 years, the greenhouse gas emissions from the passenger vehicle market has remained steady. It hasn't grown. That's despite a massive increase in population. And that's because technology is at the forefront of fuel efficiency with ICE vehicles and some of it for the electric vehicles. Go ahead, Charles.
I might add, and thank you for the question. I think it's an important question. Not only are we at risk of creating isolation or disruption between the U.S. and Canada, but what we mentioned with the provincial governments having either the same or more strict mandates provincially, we're at risk of creating layers of different regulations for a market that's around 40 million. That's a lot of layers of complexity for manufacturers, and that will have a tremendous effect, negative effect on consumers.
Because I will say, well, the tariffs certainly are the catalyst, And there's been underlying regulatory and policy issues that have been leading or have directly led to our lack of competitiveness overall in the manufacturing space. And these are some of the things that we hope that we can address and we can get this government to address, because a lot of these tweaks can be made to set the conditions, the environmental conditions for business investment to be attracted. Because at the end of the day, we're not just talking about abstract numbers. We're talking about people, families, jobs. We're talking about essentially our culture, our business and economic culture. So I guess I'm actually out of time, so there is no further question. But thank you guys for your testimony, and thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Guglielmi. Madame O'Rourke, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. I think it's fascinating that just last week we had the representatives of Linamar talk to this committee about productivity. And they told us that every year they have to cut their cost or their prices by 2% because they are so efficient. That our auto manufacturers and our parts manufacturers are extremely productive and efficient, and that our workers are the best in the world. I have seen locally expansion of Linamar and Denso. And so we need to be looking at a broader lens of the success of the past several years, how we really focus on the real problem here, which are the American tariffs, and how we can create more certainty in Canada. I believe our Prime Minister is doing that through national projects, generational investments, including the exploration and extraction of critical minerals, training and expanding markets. And to be clear, Minister Joly has stood up in the House of Commons and has talked about a focus on steel, aluminum, and energy, as well as auto and softwood lumber. We may not be able to boil the ocean, and so what we have is a strategy. My question for our panelists, and I really appreciate your perspective, is any deal going to be good, or do we want a good deal? Because there are countries in the world that have negotiated a deal and are now regretting it. Is there any value in waiting until what the American Supreme Court says in terms of tariffs so that we can get back on a decent playing field and really negotiate the best deal for Canada?
I think what I would say is that the best deal for Canada is a situation where we go back to or adhere to the rules that were negotiated under the CUSMA USMCA, that there were stringent requirements around that agreement when it was negotiated, that upped the North American content requirements in vehicles, labor value content in vehicles, a myriad of different requirements that weren't easy for any automaker to make. And we're only 6 years into that agreement and still making the adjustment. So if those conditions are adhered to, then that should be the basis on which we continue to have zero tariffs on automobiles going back and forth across the border, and that's where we need to get to. I think some people are saying that's wishful thinking. Well, maybe that's one of the reasons why the negotiations are taking so long. It's because that's the ultimate goal here.
Okay. Then I would ask a follow-up. We've talked about the importance of stronger provisions and employment insurance to support our workers, training, both for trades and also mid-career transitions, investments in the sector and supports, and you've mentioned a number of them. And so how important do you think it is to pass the federal budget on November 4th? And how damaging would it be if we were to fall into an election cycle and then further delay these negotiations?
Do you have any easy questions? I'll just speak from zoom back just a little bit. I mean, we definitely need a good deal with the U.S., and we recognize a difficult proposition. And as I said before, our voice is trying to deliver that message in the U.S. in as strong a way as possible, because really it's going to be U.S. dealers, U.S. customers talking to their members of Congress to get that done. So it's a tough environment that way. And I think, certainty at this period of time while we're negotiating, I think is in everyone's interest.
Is that my time, Mr. Carr? Okay, last question, and it's an easy one for you, Mr. Williams. We know that interest rates are coming down. Canada, the Bank of Canada was one of the first in the world to cut its interest rates, and we know that the rate of inflation is slowing. Has that been helpful at all for your dealers, and how does that translate into your financing agreements?
I'll let our economist answer that. That's why he's here.
I appreciate the easy question, even though I don't find it necessarily easy. What I would say is yes, I think in a better environment for the dealers in terms of their operation, in terms of cost of borrowing or interest rates, that has had a positive effect. Every conference that I went to with the dealers, that's the number that they were looking at in terms of their operations. But in terms of the consumers, even though the interest rate might have alleviate the situation in a way, like I mentioned earlier, the monthly payments, whether it's for lease or loans, is still going up because of the inflationary pressures that are created by some of, obviously, the U.S.-Canada trade relationship, which is extremely problematic, but also policies at home that limit the ability for our auto sector to be competitive, which has a direct reflection on the price. So in terms of operations for the dealers, it's a yes, and it's a positive welcome, and hopefully the economy stays into a trend that allows that environment to be maintained. But consumers are still, in terms of buying cars or leasing them, are still facing an environment that's extremely difficult in terms of pricing, and a lot of that is attributed to the issues that we've mentioned recently.
Merci, Madame O'Rourke. Monsieur Saint-Marie, 2 minutes, 30 seconds.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Kingston and Adams, there's a part of your answer that really surprised me. With the current tariff regime, it would be more economical for a manufacturer to have the vehicle put together in Germany or elsewhere than do it here or even the United States.
It's surprising to me as well. But what has happened is because the Americans have struck deals with countries like Korea and with the EU to provide them with lower tariff rates, and at the same time have put tariffs on the North American supply chain, and not just on autos, but steel and aluminum and all of these other components, and then have found ways to try and reduce that burden through very convoluted mechanisms. The reality is that you would be more cost effective to build these vehicles in other markets, send them to the U.S. and just pay one tariff. So that is, and frankly, that is the argument that manufacturers are making in the United States. If you want to have a strong auto manufacturing sector, you have to make it competitive to build cars in the U.S., and that includes Canada and Mexico in the supply chain. But right now, we are in a bit of a bizarre scenario where building outside of North America is advantageous.
The other lens that I would put on that, just for one of my members, BMW has the largest manufacturing facility in Spartanburg, South Carolina. They are doing what North America wanted them to do, is come and produce where the vehicles are sold. But those vehicles that are built in the U.S. now that contain Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, because they're not CUSMA compliant, are paying 25% tariff coming into the country with no remission offset. So the tariffs themselves are causing some real competitive disadvantages in the marketplace that every manufacturer is having to deal with.
Merci beaucoup. Quelle aberration, c'est vraiment inacceptable.
Well, that's an aberration. I think it's a really crazy way of doing it. I don't have time for any other questions, but thank you very much for being here today, and let's hope that we reach a good agreement and continue to maintain these good jobs.
Okay. Madame Dancho, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to dig into an issue we haven't talked too much about yet, and that is the Liberal government recently, just last week, announced it was taking measures on Stellantis and GM as a result of the Brampton Jeep Compass production cancellation and the Bright Drop EV van shutdown in Ingersoll. On Stellantis, the quota cut, again, this is the retaliatory tariffs on these. So the ones that will be able to come, my understanding is the ones that will be able to come into the country now has been cut by 50%. That won't be tariff-free, and GM, it's a 24.2% quota cut. So I suppose first to Mr. Williams, for an individual consumer, what does this mean? I mean, these are pretty popular vehicles. Dodge, Chrysler, Jeep, Ram, or Stellantis, and then, of course, GM has many models. So can you provide the committee with the impact on the individual consumer for that?
Yeah, we've been consistent on both sides of the border that we shouldn't have auto tariffs on consumers on either side and get to a free trade agreement. And I recognize that it's a complicated environment, but I was quoted interviewed on the lead story on national CBC News on Thursday that when your trading partner pulls out a gun and shoots you in your right foot, you don't pull out a gun and shoot yourself in your left foot. So I think we've got to be very, very careful on our automotive retaliation that we don't make it worse for customers, dealers, and the overall mix. Recognizing that we're not in an easy spot.
So ultimately, then, this change in quota will drive up the prices of some of these Dodge, Chrysler, Jeep, Rams, and GMs being sold to Canadian consumers. And you mentioned that the average price is already $60,000 for vehicles. So am I saying, is that correct, my assessment of what's about to happen to some of these car prices?
Correct. Car prices, when tariffs are implied, car prices go up. There's no other way around it.
Okay. I appreciate that measures are trying to be taken to address what we see as an issue with Stellantis pulling out of Brampton and after receiving billions of dollars of commitments on deals from the Liberal government. So I do appreciate what's happening, but what I really see this as is we're driving up costs for consumers, and these are very popular models, as you know, for consumers, because when the Liberals sign the deals with Stellantis, there doesn't seem to be a Canada-wide jobs guarantee, and so production is moving and investment is moving. So on one hand, we had deals signed 2-3 years ago without an employment guarantee, from what it seems, and now because of that, the consumer is getting hit with higher prices for the vehicles they buy, which are already some of the most expensive. So just kind of an assessment of I think where we're at with this, which is a pretty big mess under the current leadership in Ottawa, that consumers are being hit, auto workers are being laid off, and multi-billion-dollar deals were signed with a number of the companies you represent, Mr. Kingston, and yet those companies are promising billions of dollars investment in the U.S. and tens of thousands of good American jobs. So really just isn't a great situation for the Canadian auto sector, and we really have no commitments from the Liberal government of when we're going to get a deal, which you've all said you need for certainty if you're going to keep the jobs that you currently have and ever hope to build new jobs. So pretty big mess under the current government from our estimation. Ms. Borelli, did you have any comments you wanted to end off? Because I think I have 2 minutes left. Thank you for all of your comments today.
Thank you. Thank you. With the current EV mandate, what type of infrastructure will be needed to ensure that the mandate be met in the right time frame? Do you believe that this infrastructure is possible? And will the power grid be able to support this expansion?
It's my favorite question. No. So just to give you a sense of where we're at right now, we need 100,000 chargers, public EV chargers, this year. This is according to NRCan. It's not our estimate. There are 36,000. Just this morning, I decided to look at the rate of growth of charging infrastructure. I was curious, have we made progress since last year? 3,500 chargers so far this year have come online, 3,500. So we need, again, according to NRCan, 40,000 a year, and at best we're seeing about 3,000 or 4,000. So it's just, there is simply no way to have the infrastructure installed at the pace needed to support mandated targets. And then, of course, the bigger challenge as you build out that infrastructure is you have to have transformer upgrades and line upgrades to accommodate the electricity. It can be done, but it has to be thoughtful. There has to be a plan to do that, and it's quite costly as well. So that's where we stand right now in infrastructure.
How's the time?
I think you're at 7 seconds, so.
Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, that's going to bring us towards the end of today's meeting. Very much appreciate the witnesses availing themselves, particularly on short notice, in order to provide some guidance and insight for us here. We appreciate very much that it's a difficult time with a lot of headwinds, so we are certainly watching keenly and hope for the sake of the country and our future prosperity that we can move towards a situation and circumstance that is improved upon from the one that we see today. Colleagues, we'll be meeting again on this study on Wednesday. Meeting adjourned.